Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. What is a museum? That deceptively simple question harbors more complexity than may readily be apparent. Defining museums as places where collections of objects are put on public display, for example, runs smack against a number of fine institutions that preserve a sense of the collective memory with little or no recourse to objects at all. Even more challenging is consideration of what role museums should play in a 21st century world already marked by dramatic change. Static interpretations of the past are proving inadequate to the intricate new patterns of this and other modern societies. There may now be compelling reason for museums to add greater social agency to their traditional cultural functions, becoming more prominent as meeting places for the diverse strains of our multicultural society. In this way, museums may grow beyond preserving our sense of the past to helping us mutually imagine a more cohesive future. My guest is Elaine Heumann Gurian, author of Civilizing the Museum. Elaine, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you for having me.
It's a delight to have you here, and I think that delight's going to be shared by everyone watching, Elaine. And let me also hold up this fine book, which is the book that you have put together, and it's the book we're going to be discussing. And it's a lovely, lovely cover, if I must say
Thank you.
myself. And the contents are no less wonderful. And here's my first observation, Elaine, that the book that you have written is very much a product of who you are. That is to say, I think one could say that you are not traditionally trained to be a museum person, at least in any of the normal or formal senses we hear about. You're a woman, obviously, and the daughter of German Jewish immigrants, and that history is very important to you. You're a cultural veteran, so to speak, of the 60s and 70s, and I think those influences are also quite strong. And the essays in this book, the 22 of them, are the fruit of 35 years of work in the museum world, much of it international. And I'm wondering, Elaine, as I cite all those various qualities and many more that I could cite, if they underscore what's, I thought, pretty much emphasized, your strong belief in inclusiveness.
Absolutely. It's really the underpinning of all my work. And in rethinking all these essays for this book, I realized that that thread was really the deepest thread. And that is that if the patrimony belongs to all of us, then a museum has an obligation to make it accessible to all of us. And
that is because it is a common product, so to speak, of everyone. Therefore,
Absolutely.
It should be accessible to everyone. That would seem, and you phrase it very eloquently there, and I say also in the book, that would seem so self-evident, Elaine, that one would have a hard time, at least initially, thinking of resistance. But there is resistance to the idea.
Well, there's resistance in a couple of ways. One of them comes from a kind of beginning when museums were beginning, and they were the signs and trappings of power and of conquest. And they were exotica that illustrated that some people had access to very foreign places and other people didn't. And then there is this notion of educating others, that there's a set of canon that you want others to understand. So for a long time, museums thought, we might say today in a patronizing way, that they were places of education, but they were determining the education.
Isn't the crux of what you're saying right now, Elaine, really the definition of what truth is? In other words, for a long time, it might have been very fashionable to believe that there was, quote, one sort of truth that everyone had to adhere to, but that now, to be more inclusive, you have to also recognize the truth itself is more subjective, perhaps, in its interpretations.
But that argument is not a settled argument. And it gets mixed up with the notion of excellence and therefore the notion of quality. If you have peoples who have multiple worldviews and therefore differing canons, then how you adopt multiple canons and allow people to make sense of it is a continuing discussion in the museum world.
Is it your feeling, your belief after 35 years and continuing to do it, that where do you think the balance lies now? That there's more acceptance of it, or is the fight still as difficult as it was when you began?
You know, at the end of my career, I am less hopeful than I was in the beginning.
Really?
And it makes me very sad to say that. There is a kind of intransigence in museums and a sense of that gets put together with a kind of social climbing. Mm-hmm. Because museums have a social cachet that, for example, libraries don't have, and they have boards with social cachets, one worries that that gets translated into the way in which the public is served. So,
and let me see if I can, that's a very, very powerful and interesting statement, Elaine. Are we talking about here issues of power and status?
We are.
Of control?
Absolutely.
And would that mean that, at least, I don't want to impugn people, not necessarily, but that when we, at times at least, when we hear the calls for, quote, traditional museums and the traditional role of museums, we're really hearing arguments for a kind of intractability, a resistance to including more people into what they do and how they do it?
It's not a simple polarization. I would be unfair to suggest that. But there are elements of what you've just said that you can find. Mm-hmm. The issue of excellence is a real issue, or the issue of authority or of factual information is a real issue as you start to think about this notion of shared authority, which you see on the internet now and which has a lot to do with inclusiveness. Mm-hmm. So it really is a negotiation, and the negotiation is not settled at all. Right. I come from the inclusive side of the negotiation, but I respect the people who come from a different position.
Is this generational? In other words?
No.
It's not?
I wish it was generational.
Because then, of course, nature would take care of it.
No, it isn't. It's in part having to do with your training as a scholar. That in some ways, for some people, that having worked so hard to amass a personal set of real scholarship, you want to impart it as you know it.
Right.
And the debate of scholarship that you see in the academic community gets played out in visual form in the museum world.
You, a few moments ago, very eloquently stated the reason for inclusiveness, that is, that people should have access to what we have all helped create, what we've experienced and lived through. Turning that question around, and particularly addressing groups that may be resistant to inclusiveness, what would your answer be to the benefit to the museum itself and to the learning community of which it's a part? Well,
let me even move up one level. I think whole societies need spaces where people are safe, that are strangers one to another. Some people now refer to it as the third space.
Or the congregate space?
Or I refer to it as the congregate space, a space where you think that it will be safe, even if you don't talk to anybody that you're with. Without those spaces, and they include the train station and the shopping mall, the whole society becomes balkanized. And they have so much importance that people use them as targets in war. They become symbolic for pan-safety, if you will. And therefore, it's essential that we take away the barriers to the museums that keep some people out or make people believe it's not for them in order to achieve further safety for the whole society.
Several things about that, Elaine. I think that's very perceptive. I think you're saying as we become more diverse and fragmented, to avoid becoming balkanized, as you said, we need places where we physically come together, but also, and this is the question, you must mean intellectually as well. There's not just enough to gather there, but to interact. Is that right?
I think that as well, but I would move your intellectual word into tangibility. What museums have as a competitive advantage is tangible evidence. And tangible evidence in its three-dimensionality has a quality and an importance to all of us that rivals the printed word.
You're talking about the objects themselves, the exhibits on display?
Well, I no longer use the word objects because often the tangible evidence is manufactured. because it has something to do with understanding how something worked or how something felt.
Right.
But I am talking about being in a physical presence, in the presence of real things or of things in general.
Accepting your point about this need for congregate spaces that museums can help serve, helping people come together, and being in the before the evidence of our past, so to speak, however it's conveyed, it would also seem to me that implicit in what you've said is that this public that comes together to learn, to grow, to interact in that space probably should and probably must have some role in deciding what's on those walls and in that space. Well, and this deciding factor may be where one of the hurdles is in accepting all of this.
That's really the biggest question of the New Age, the one that you've just suggested. And there's precursors for that. But let me give you some examples. In the past 25 years, the most important change in museums have been brought to us by indigenous people, who are the descendants of the manufacturers of much of what we own. And their understanding of their own objects, in many cases, is fundamentally different than the understanding that brought them there. In order for us to understand the people themselves, we must understand their role with these objects.
I think there are some marvelous examples in this book of what you're talking about right now, of which you've been a part. And I refer to your work. Among the many museums you worked with, here and abroad, is the American Indian Museum here.
Right.
And it seemed to me as I read those essays and that chapter that beginning to appreciate I'll use the word object for lack of a better one for the moment at least, that they can be living as opposed to our view of them as inanimate, that they need a breathing space, they have to be treated in ways that may not be immediately apparent to people outside that community, is a very important dimension that just has to be built into these.
It's a fundamental change for museums who believe, for example, when they gathered things, that we had, all of us, access to everything that was interesting. So the notion of secret and sacred, the notion that not everything would be on view, was a fundamentally different one for us. The notion that things are living and have spirit was extremely different, though in a Christian world we understand that, but we understand it in a different location. And the notion of ownership, the very notion of ownership started to change.
For example, I think it's mentioned in this book, I don't think I know it, that when tribes, for example, cede, again, objects or properties to museums, they may do so on the basis of retaining ownership themselves, putting them there for a period of time, and taking them back when they need them for ceremonial or other purposes. This is a new idea, a new conception of ownership that museums are going to have to embrace.
And mostly worldwide, they have begun to embrace that. Te Papa, the museum that you mentioned, which is the National Museum of New Zealand, ceded all the ownership back to the particular tribes for which they owned objects, and then in consultation with the descendants of the makers, determined what to do with it.
Elaine, in addition to these issues of ownership and what's on display and using museum space as congregate public space, it seems to me that we're also here talking about, and I think you use this phrase, and you may not use it, but I think this is close to it, a role of public service that museums should embrace. And it would seem to me those two words, public service, public agency, what do you want to call it, may again be one of the biggest hurdles, so to speak, for the traditional museum to accept.
It goes back, George, to the thing you said about intellectual interchange. Where do we have places where we can talk to each other face to face? It's the Hyde Park corner, if you will.
Right.
In the world of blogging, where now people feel quite enfranchised to talk to powers of authority, will museums make it possible for people to see each other while they do that?
But you know, and the mention of blogging I think is right on target, Elaine. it's also a world in which issues are edgier, so to speak, and perhaps more charged with meaning and with impact on societies. And when you bring together these diverse groups, you're going to have obviously diverse and sometimes heated opinions. Therefore, when you talk about museums taking on this role of greater public service, would there also be a corresponding need for them to, at times at least, to be more willing to be advocates for certain things? I think you can't do this in a kind of bland way, I would think, to make any kind of impact at all in society.
It's a really important question you've asked me, and one has in this book, I talk about different kinds of museums. Mm-hmm. The responsibility of the National Museum, which is an attempt to reconcile all members, all citizens, has a different role than a museum in control of a certain segment of the society. There's a very interesting study just done in Australia in which the public was asked about advocacy, and they wanted way more advocacy than museums are comfortable with. Mm. So absolutely, there are many places looking at advocacy. The issue of ecology and science museums is one of the places where you see it most strongly.
If we waved a magic wand, Elaine, so to speak, and got perhaps not everything we would want, but at least museums moving strongly in this direction, and I know from having spoken to you earlier that you're not convinced they really are yet, at least sufficiently. We talked about the groups, the museums themselves, but what do we all gain? What do we get out of it?
I would turn it around by showing you the contemporary model of libraries. Mm-hmm. There is no mayor in this country who does not believe that libraries and public parks aren't part of his civic responsibility. And yet he or she tends to feel differently about museums only because museums have been more elitist in the way they thought of themselves. Mm-hmm. But they are essentially indoor parks. Mm-hmm. Indoor parks of recreation, of aesthetic, of education. And they are service providers in the same way libraries are. So my hope is that we will see ourselves in the same way, and that the public will see ourselves as one of the agencies of service, educational refreshment service in the society.
The word you use in the book, I think that touches on this, is blurring. Mm-hmm. That the museums, and I think you even go so far as to include the malls, if you will, in this kind of sort of spectrum of learning experiences that people can have. It also seems to me that you give great emphasis to those museums that are approaching this in a very innovative way. And one of them, and I think one of them actually is one of my favorites for many reasons, the Holocaust Museum here in Washington, as a place where elements of perhaps traditional museum culture, but also the theater, and even the museum as a religious space, are brought together for a very different kind of non-traditional learning experience that goes very deep into people.
And the outcome of what is truly a work of genius, the outcome of the Holocaust Museum is that it doesn't date. It gets transformed into a metaphor where public discourse of the daily topic of inclusion, of prejudice, gets played out. So if you eavesdrop at the exit of the Holocaust Museum, my instinct is you don't hear them discussing the Holocaust today, but Iraq, and that the role of the government in the notion of hostility gets discussed, and personal responsibility gets discussed. But it is not explicit in the museum, it is implicit as you go through it.
And isn't that the genius, that you take an experience that, dreadful as it was, can be called a particular experience, but allow an audience to develop its general understanding of it and apply it to new things on its own, so to speak?
And that's the highest form of art, when it gets transformed into metaphor. Mm-hmm. And where people can then start to make some decisions about not only their personal life, but their congregate life.
There's another aspect to the Holocaust Museum, your time there, and what the museum continues to do, and that is the product of one mind, largely the product of one brilliant conception, one vision. And I think that's important to me. It was very striking in the book, Elaine, because it's tempting sometimes to think of everything as a product of a committee, of a formal structure, of having many voices, and that obviously has its place, but there's no substitute for this, for genius.
Well, when you find genius, there's no substitute. It's very hard to find. One of the things I keep being struck by when I look at, for example, the Washington Post online, is that they have figured out a way in which they keep the authority of the writer, let's hope the writer is a genius, available, and the multiple voices on the sidebars available simultaneously. And we, in contemporary society, are learning to traverse across those so that we can have multiple opinions and still access to genius. That, I think, is what's going to happen next.
Wow, that's intriguing. Thinking of the Holocaust Museum and other great museums in the world, what is the kind of learning experience that goes on in these places, Elaine, or that you think should occur? For example, I was struck by what I said at the outset, I learned from the book, that there are museums in this world that are extremely successful and creative with no objects at all. There's a diaspora museum, I think, in Israel that does this very successfully. And other places, of course, use objects or even copies of objects with which we're now very comfortable and we didn't use to use. But that it seemed to me the most extraordinary thing that could happen when things work is what I think you used the phrase, the landmark experience. Is that when something happens within the viewer, the attendee, when he or she is moved beyond just being merely entertained? There's a kind of catharsis that they...
Well, landmark experiences, which you hope to have, are like tentpoles. And they become lifelong references. You often don't know that it happens in front of you. It becomes the reference for other things. So as you go on with life, you keep saying, remember that.
Right.
They are because new insights have happened that have moved you in some way or another. Museums really are longitudinal places. They attach that experience of realness, to the rest of your life, which you then can have some places of reference, if you will.
Because they do that, and because of what we've spoken of here about the Holocaust Museum, has there been any research on just this phenomena that years later, or in a kind of a long-term sense, people would realize that experiences they'd undergone or been exposed to, and that in the museum setting had significantly influenced how they looked at life?
There is now long-term research going on of asking people to recollect museums of their childhood, if you will, for example, and what they remember. The significance is not that everybody can tell you in a kind of aha sense that this was the most important thing that happened to them, but more that it became either the end of a journey or the beginning of a journey that then they read something later, they had different experiences. It helped to fashion out the whole landscape for them.
You also worked very productively with the Native American
I did, yes.
Museum here in Washington. And that's a lovely chapter in this book. I think it's entitled A Jew Among Indians. And tell us about that, because it seems to me there was a great deal of cultural learning that you underwent in that setting yourself, and that corresponded to things in your own history and background.
Well, the most profound thing that happened to me as a result of doing that was that I was then asked to go to the Holocaust Museum, and I had been very resistant. And I remember elders at the National Museum of the American Indian sat me down and said, when your elders call you home, you go home. So I left, reluctantly, the National Museum of the American Indian and went to help my own people. I learned absolute profound differences. And I learned that multiple voices was the only way that the public could begin to appreciate that there was more ways to look at things and more ways that could enrich them than a single voice, than a single authority.
That's powerful, Elaine. You know, as I said at the outset, your scholarship, your argument, your central thesis in life, they're all of a piece. I mean, the experience, it's just marvelous to me how it all feeds in together. Where can these things go? For example, I'm very struck, we all have our histories. We live in a society that has not always told all the stories. And I think at root, what you're saying here is those stories have to be told. Museums are a place for storytelling, and there should be multiple narratives told. Can that build unity? I mean, can we, that insight from the tribal elders at the American Indian Museum to help you understand what you would later do at the Holocaust Museum, is that the kind of thing that could happen to all of us more broadly if we got more stories?
Yeah, absolutely. If you understand that on the other team are human beings, life gets at least slightly more peaceable. I don't arrogate to museums that they are the only anything. What I say is that they're a piece of a tapestry, and much more important piece of the tapestry than we have understood. And they are much more important because of their tangibility. And that they need to be made available. One of the chapters in here is about making them free.
Right.
That people use things that are free entirely differently than they use things that they have spent a great deal of money. And they start to make friends with free services that they can use episodically, and they stop reifying them. So I'm hopeful that that will happen more broadly as well.
Elaine, I share your hopes and your ambitions. I really do. And one of the things this book does is bring home to us how important this subject and this struggle is for all of us. We're all the beneficiaries. For that, I thank you very much, Elaine Gurian.
Thank you.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. Elaine, thank you.
What a pleasure. Thank you so much.